for now, we are moving to our next speaker, which is Tom Harrison. And he has been keeper of the Department of Greece in Rome at the British Museum since January 2024, so very recent, where he also leads the recovery program of return of stolen items. He was previously Rathbone Professor for Ancient History and Classical Archaeology at the University of Liverpool from 2004 to 2015, and Professor of Ancient History at the University of St. Andrews from 2015 and to 2023. He's a specialist in ancient Greek history, particularly Herodotus and early Greek history writing, and the relationship between the Greeks and the non-Greeks, especially the people from the Persian Empire. He's currently completing a book on Greek and the Greek Regulus belief. So, please, Tom.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's a great pleasure to be here. Like others, I'd like to offer my congratulations to the museum, which is our host today. Not only my own congratulations, but also those of my colleagues. My director asked me specifically to pass on my current director, I should say. He's only there for about 3 more weeks. Mark Jones asked me to pass on my congratulations and my admiration as well for the work you've done here. It's been an invaluable opportunity to hear people. I hope this is something we may do again in other contexts. We may carry on these conversations, maybe kind of drilling in on particular problems like, as we call them, reserves or stores. I think it would be extremely useful. I think it's I've worked in a museum only for 1 year and 3 months, and maybe it's a very particular museum, and it's certainly been a very particular context of the last 1.5 years or so. But I think it's very easy to get lost in one's own kind of particularities and not to realise that actually the issues we're dealing with and actually some of the solutions we imagine are brilliantly imaginative have all been done by other people already. So learning that and learning about the pitfalls is hugely useful. So I've learned lots from all of you. So thank you, especially as a new boy in the world of museums, having converted, and also not an archaeologist. As was made clear, I'm a historian, but I'm even at the sort of furthest, most abstract extreme of the historical range, if you like, a kind of meta-historian, so it's even more difficult for me dealing with so many objects. I mean, it's also worth saying, I think, about our particular context before I move on to some of the details of our plan. So I'll be talking about our master plan, as we now call it. It's gone by many names. It was originally called the Rosetta Project, and then it struck somebody that calling it the Rosetta Project was unfortunate when this was one of our most contested objects. So then for a while it had no name, or was called the project formerly known as the Rosetta Project, and now it's the master plan, which shows you how much things have evolved in the last few years. I think we're in an unusual position because of all the change that's happened in the museum. We're in a position in which we have a need for a major redesign. We have some basic concepts, but at the same time, and I think this will probably become painfully clear in what I say, at the same time, I feel as though our museum is kind of struggling to find the kind of identity that, unless you're all being very, very diplomatic, that many of you have got already for your museums. I mean, it seems to me, in a number of cases we've heard today, there's a very strong identity, there's a very strong sense of purpose and leadership that has been expressed. I think in our case we are obviously a museum that is vastly complex, but I think we're struggling to move towards that, and that's why I think it's particularly useful. My role in the last year has predominantly been in terms of recovering stolen objects. I went from being an ivory tower academic to being an art theft recovery specialist in about 3 months. So it's been a kind of cruel baptism. But I think that has also changed the museum in very many ways. And I'll come back to talk about documentation on my very last slide. But I think in the course of, since August when we went public, with the bad news that's been happening in our museum, it was, first of all, an enormous shock to colleagues. Obviously, by that stage, it wasn't a shock to me. I had 2 weeks of blissful innocence when I arrived at the museum. most of which I spent in the Netherlands, and then I got back and discovered all this. So it was a very kind of primal shock, but also it's led to a complete recalibration of priorities. So there are a number of things I'll talk about, like our storage strategy or documentation, which are fundamentally, the priorities have changed in the course of the last 6 months. And so to some extent, we're in a position in which one part of the museum is steaming ahead with what they've been told before, but it's very evident that in some respects, we're going to have to pull back and do things differently. So storage, the plan was to organize it entirely by types of material in a very heavily centralized way. We're now almost certainly not going to do that because of the danger of having too many people having access to too much material, and so we're going to change it. I will say later on, but I might as well say now, we've decided we will fully document our collection in 5 years, so everything will have full documentation and an image online within 5 years. So we're doing that at the same time as we're trying to do the thinking for this rebuild, this master plan. So these priorities have changed in interesting ways in very short order. So, and I should say also, we have a new director. Did I just show you the new director, or did he not appear? Here is the building, which I've now forgotten why I was going to tell you about this, but I think I was going to say also about the very particular political context. So we've had some interesting observations. Did I go too far? Oh yeah, sorry, slideshow. We need. Yes. Perfect, thank you very much. I'll use this instead. So we have a new director arriving in a few weeks who will, I'm sure, give clarity to many of these things. And I just wanted to say one other thing, because I think the issues of organisation, political control, and so on, or independence, autonomy, have been a kind of interesting theme through the day. I suppose we're probably a kind of hybrid in reality. So we will always say that we're not a state institution, we're not state-run, we are independent to that extent. On the other hand, we are civil servants in a sense, and we are governed by a board of trustees, the chair of whom is a former politician of the same party as the current government, some of whom are appointed by the government, some of whom are appointed by us, some of whom are appointed by learned societies. So we are formally an arm's length body, so we are at a length of an arm from the government, but we are also accountable, and we're accountable to their agendas in some ways. So it's an interesting kind of balance that we have to play, and I think we're more independent or less independent in certain contexts and at certain moments, which is, I think, inevitably how these things will go. So we start with the building. So the British Museum is not falling down, despite the impression we've given in the last year, either metaphorically or actually. But I think that where this all begins effectively is the realization that the building as it stands is not one which can be left in its current state. The fabric is this is no secret, the fabric is tired. I receive regular updates called water ingress updates, which we get on a weekly basis about all the work taken to address it. It's highly professional, but clearly a lot of the problem is the nature of the infrastructure. And in particular, sorry, I've done it again, the fact that the building is not a single building. So here you have the full site, pretty much the full site, and I'll show it to you in different images in a moment, architectural illustrations, for example. But if you look at the crucial part, which is the west-hand side, so everything from the Great Court and the Egyptian Sculpture Gallery west to the Divine Gallery, which is the one with two ends on the left. That is, as you can see, I think, in an aerial photograph, it's a kind of hodgepodge of lots of buildings. I think there are 17 separate constructions there. So lots of moments at which they filled in a building and then kind of realized there was a gap and they could use that for some more Assyrian reliefs. And so that's the way they've used it. And because then of things like wiring that have been put in kind of channels up on the roof, some of the problematic parts of the roof are very difficult to access. So you then have you've created more problems for yourself as a result of this very, very progressive history. It's really only the core of the building, the quadrangle, which was designed by Robert and Sidney Smirke around 200 years ago, and then it took a long time to finish, which is completely sacrosanct in the development that we have now. Everything to the west of that is to differing degrees capable of being rebuilt. So a large number of the modern buildings, I'll show you some which have a kind of tiling on the floor, which we tend to refer to as the bathroom tiling, because it looks like a sort of 1970s bathroom. They are clearly going to be demolished and rebuilt entirely. Others can be, because they've already been changed a lot, can be fundamentally changed as well. And the Devine Gallery is an interesting kind of point of controversy. It's clearly not a desirable building in which to house the British portion of the Parthenon marbles. So exactly how that can be changed in the future is a kind of key problem. So where we're going to start is with the kind of foundational level. So this is an image of a building that looks very nice on the outside, but actually is the Energy Centre, which is a large project which will begin next year. So it's called the ECP, the Energy Centre project, which is going to, this goes back to the issues of sustainability we've heard a lot about in the course of the day. It's an attempt to try to put our energy system on a single modern footing with air pumps on the roof, and so on, and a single source of electricity coming in at one point, getting rid of something like 160 separate rooms designated for heating. It's going to involve a huge amount of disruption, so new channels dug in the corridors in the stores, lots of material which will be already, my material in particular from my department, which is being put on pallets to be moved away from the walls in case of vibration, and a lot of moves to the new storage facility. So this is really the beginning of the process, which will begin next year, early next year. Also around now, so last week we announced the beginning of the architectural competition, but it's an architectural competition without a clear plan for what we're going to do in the future. The competition, which will be completed in the new year, so early 2025, is for a concept, but a concept still with lots of question marks associated with it. So we're putting them through tests of their capacity, tests of their vision, rather than asking them for a finished plan of the entire structure. The other thing which is nearly built, so these are the building blocks which are in place, is something called the BM Ark. I think it's a little bit of a pun, like Noah's Ark. This is where objects go to be safe from the floods of disruption with our building plan, which is on the outskirts of Reading. It's a partnership with the University of Reading, about 25 miles west of London. You can see, I think, from the extreme kind of clean simplicity of the kind of warehouse look on the top image, or the completely false contrived architectural individuals on the bottom pictures, that it's not fully in use. It's going to be opened formally in the autumn. At the moment we have, particularly casts have moved. So we used to have a large warehouse on the west end of London, a house called Blythe House, which was shared with other national museums, where a lot of these were stored previously. That's now been emptied of all its material. It's familiar from many spy films. It's often used in films like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and other John le Carré films, because of it being so outdated in its infrastructure. So that's now been abandoned. We've given it back to the government, and slowly large stone material is moving. So the very large pieces of the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, steps from that building, have moved to Reading, and then slowly other material will go. So crucially our mosaics and heavy stone sculpture from the stores, and then clearly it's also going to be used as a storehouse, as we've heard here, where material can go during the renovations in this crucial period. So it's a kind of vital part of the whole redevelopment. Exactly how it'll work in terms of staffing and whether curatorial staff will to some extent shift there as well, I think is unclear, but it's likely that that depending on the type of material you work on, there will be a shift of staffing and research expertise, scientific research expertise, to the west as well. So I've tried here to sketch the outline of the area that's going to be subject to the big redesign called the Western Range project. So it's the range of buildings to the west, these many buildings. a very broad envelope in blue in the top slide. That's the coloured in area, as it were, is the full estate of the museum, because we also own the houses which neighbour us. We own all those houses which are rented out commercially for the most part. And then a slightly more precise red line. Exactly, the lines of the red line are critical for me, especially because my office is about 1 metre south of the red line. So I now know I'm free from danger for a few years yet. Anyway, so that's the full range. It includes the Egyptian sculpture gallery, room 4 of the museum, which clearly is going to remain largely intact, but also others, as I said before, which are going to be fundamentally restructured, and I'll show you some slides of those buildings as we go on through it. But I think it's fair to say that nothing that is there now will be in the same place when it goes back, unless by some strange accident. The plan is for a complete redesign of all these galleries, and everything will leave the permanent collection in these galleries and on the first floor. So it's not just the ground floor, all my department's first floor galleries and Middle East's first floor galleries, and possibly Egypt and Sudan's galleries will move. I'll show you a more detailed slide of that in a minute. And the expectation at the moment is they will move in late 2026. By the end of 2026, we will have evacuated the entire western range of the building. I won't even give a question mark with a date for when we'll be back in, and the 2026 date I think is highly likely to change. But at that point we're talking about interim displays within the museum of all our collections in Greece and Rome, and similarly for Egypt and Sudan as well, and a lot more material going on loan. And so the structure of our kind of exchange partnerships and the learning partnerships within the UK are still being worked out, but it's going to be a very different world for a number of years. So that, I think, is, if you like, the basic scenario. Where it gets more vague is, if you like, what goes on within the structure. So I've given you here, by department, where they are at the moment. So Greece and Rome, the big green amount, we were very lucky in terms of our amount of space. Egypt and Sudan, I should say even the statue of Ramses is supposed to be leaving, even though it's larger than the doors. So we'll have to, at best guess, make a hole in the wall of the Devine Gallery in order to get it out. But my colleague, the keeper of Egypt and Sudan, exaggerates the weight of it every week. It seems to go up by a few tons, just to emphasize the difficulty of doing this. He has no way of knowing the size or scale of it. Egypt and Sudan, where there's a question mark about whether the first floor galleries, which include the display of human remains and mummies, will come down or not. And then Middle East. But the plan is that all of those will come into the Western Range, question mark, on the ground floor. So, I mean, I think probably the most central open question is whether we go for a minimalist or a maximalist option. So under the old director, Hartwig Fischer, there was very much a model that we would be scaled down, and he was also minimalist in terms of the number of objects. So we have 80,000 objects on display, and the idea is that that should reduce. He was very much a kind of art gallery director in his aesthetic approach. I think now we're looking much more towards, but it's not certainly a done deal, towards a much larger structure in which we have, we reopen the lower ground galleries in a completely reworked way, which were open in a brief period in the last century. And we also create another level above the Western Range galleries. So we have much more space, and we hopefully integrate all of the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world in one set of galleries to the west of the museum. I mean, a crucial underlying philosophy here is to recalibrate the balance between ancient European and Near Eastern cultures, which have been the dominant force within the museum, and the ethnographic collections, so-called, from the past, and the rest of the world, which are very much less present in proportional terms. So 38% of the gallery is this Western Range. So we're very, if you include the first floor galleries, we're at 50% of the whole. So the idea is to recalibrate that and create much more space for our Latin American material, the North American material, Oceania, and so on. So to create a much more balanced global picture, if you like. Within that, I mean, there are some key intellectual agendas, and I'll talk about those a little bit. I mean, how do how do you genuinely reintegrate or create an integrated narrative of ancient Near East, Egypt and Sudan, and the Greek and Roman world? And of course, the Greek and Roman world, which is my department, is not just Greek and Roman, as we're very keen to insist. The Lycians wouldn't recognize themselves as Greek, I think, if you met a Lycian in the street. So how you do that and maintain a level of coherence or transparency in terms of an audience, and we're very alert to the fact that when people arrive in the museum, they say, where is Japan, where is Greece, where is Egypt, in a very straightforward way. How do you manage to maintain that balance of presenting a picture of the ancient world which is one of more fluid identities, and at the same time not involve complete confusion? Clearly, to some extent, you have to slow down when the monuments demand it, when the amount of space required for, I'll show you some of the outsized monuments later, demand it. On the other hand, there are some really kind of key intellectual questions, I think, that we are having to confront. At the moment, there is a Hellenistic World Gallery, Gallery 22, which is named the World of Alexander. Now, if we want to present the Seleucid, Ptolemaic world and the old Greek world, if you like, in a single gallery, there's no way my colleagues will allow me to call it the Hellenistic world. And as I know from teaching in universities for 25 years, no students really understand what the word Hellenistic means, and telling them the history of the term doesn't help always very much. So it goes back to some of the issues we were hearing about from Marc-Antoine a moment ago about those fluid chronological and geographical also boundaries. How do we make it transparent at the same time as not creating a narrative that we find actually difficult? We don't, I think, want Alexander to be the caesura between one world and another, even if it was a fundamental change. So I think we're thinking in terms of a kind of long Hellenistic period, but also clearly looking at it from different perspectives as well, rather than simply from a Greek cultural, from the point of view of expansion. Here we have one, I mean, there are sensitivities in relation to this. This is one panel from the ante-room, as it were, of the Parthenon Gallery now, in which we make the claim that here in the British Museum you can see the Parthenon in dialogue with the Persepolis friezes, the material we have from Persepolis. Much of it is cast, but there is some original material, and the Lycian reliefs and others. It's a kind of slightly hollow claim, I think we'd say at the moment. I mean, it's built into the structure of the museum, so you move, in the old vision, you move through a progress of civilizations from Egypt to Assyria to the Greek world. As you go through that, that was the way it was conceived originally. So I'm very keen to insist that we want to try to make sure this dialogue happens, but I want to uncouple it from, if you like, the justification that we very regularly use for why the Parthenon marbles in London are in London. So those are some of the issues. I think we want to make this dialogue a real one, but at the same time are very conscious of the politics of it. I think at a local level it's a lot easier. I mean, these are two objects, in fact, from the same site, some East Greek pottery, and something which looks very evidently Egyptian, from the site of Naucratis in Egypt. Now, the history of our museum is very much department by department, so when the finds from Naucratis came in, anything classical was given to my department, anything that looked Egyptian was given to the Egyptian department, Egyptian antiquities as it was then, and they have never met since. There is no kind of combining. So, and this scenario is repeated over and over and over again. So if we want to give an impression of the Mediterranean world as being one which is, I don't want to say fully hybrid, but involves a level of hybridity on a regular basis at a local level, then we have to find ways of bringing the collection apart and dissolving the departmental boundaries, which have been the fundamental determinant of the way in which the galleries are organised. And then obviously there are issues of find spot and context which matter. So I'm in a regular point of dispute, I think, between departments, but also a matter of critique from outside is the location within the museum of one very famous object, the head of Augustus from Meroe in Sudan, which was dug up by my former department in Liverpool many years ago, at the beginning of the 20th century. It was found in Sudan. It was found buried under the steps of the Queen in Nubia. So it can be framed very much in that context as a kind of anti-Roman gesture, not just as it is mostly at the moment, as just a kind of example of Roman imperial portraiture. So finding the right way of balancing that, how do you balance, if you like, an emphasis on the longue durée of Egyptian history or British history at the same time as trying to ensure the diversity of the picture you give of the Roman Empire more widely? I would obviously like to absorb these into a very diverse kind of impression of the provinces and their response to the centre of Rome, but there are different narratives in debate with one another, if you like. There are then other issues of diversity which we could get into very easily. So I mentioned the recalibration of the museum between different collections. One very striking example of how the collection more widely is not balanced is the fact that there are only 3 objects on display out of 80,000 objects which come from the Caribbean, even though, of course, the Caribbean is the source of much of the tarnished, if I can put it very mildly, wealth that supported the collections of many of our founding figures, like Hans Sloane, the founder of the museum in 1753. So there are some very clear issues of balance. This was probably made by a slave. And then when we move into our own collections, I think when we have the reintegration of the monumental material on the ground floor with the small finds from the first floor, there are opportunities for creating, I think, a very different kind of historical picture. This is one small object which is on display already in our Gallery 69. Gallery 69 is the gallery of Greek and Roman life, which is, on the one hand, a kind of perennial favourite. Students, primary school students in particular, can always be found kind of carpeting the floor, sitting down, doing drawings. On the other hand, it's also extremely dated in a number of respects, and this is one example. So this is a tag worn by a Roman slave, as you can tell from the text which you've had time to read. It's included in a very old-fashioned wooden case that looks a bit like a television set, which the heading of which is writing. That's the frame. There is no kind of display in relation to slavery, whereas actually there's a whole number of objects, of which this is one very striking one, which give you not exactly an unmediated slave or enslaved person voice, but at least give you access to the real-life personal experience of unfree individuals in the ancient world in a much more vivid way than you would otherwise. So I think we need to obviously reconsider our displays fundamentally in that regard. The danger we have in some contexts, and this I think is a very particular British Museum problem, relates to how we are very much in the public eye, and even though we're not politically beholden in one sense, we are in other senses driven by a kind of political debate. So this is one small example of the way in which updating is needed across the board. So this is, on the left-hand side, you can see an old label. When I say old, it wasn't that old. It was only removed last year. It was in my first month, I think, in the museum, so sort of March, April of last year, which is describing one of the so-called Hellenistic grotesques in the Hellenistic World Gallery, the World of Alexander, and a graduate student working with us on the representation of disability in the ancient world and more widely in the museum, flagged some particularly problematic items. On the right-hand side, you see the general panel now, which if you like, covers the material and tries to bring out the nuance that you want, on the one hand, to describe these representations in a way which is not pejorative, as it is on the left. It's now a lot more medicalized, but at the same time, you don't want, I think, to lose the texture of the ancient representation and the nature of caricature and so on. So getting that balance right is not easy. This was nearly featured in an article in a weekend newspaper, the Mail on Sunday, which, if you know the British newspaper scene, is a very conservative newspaper. They did a freedom of information request and asked what labels we changed, and they were about to run a story saying, look at the British Museum, how appallingly woke they are, that they're changing labels about disability. And I assume that at some point the editor said, come on, that's perfectly reasonable change to make. But I think it shows you how kind of crazily sensitized the environment we're operating in is. And it seems to me that in many respects, one of the biggest challenges we have is to find a way to navigate through the Scylla and Charybdis of the culture wars, where we try to represent a more diverse representation of the ancient world, but at the same time don't say that we're doing that too much. In fact, I don't use the word diverse any longer. I now use words like kind of rich experience and so on, just to avoid that criticism coming in regularly. And I can feel in any audience in the museum there are these two constituencies, one very pro, one very anti-restitution, one very aggressively anti-woke, one very pro. So it's a very difficult balance I think we need to strike in trying to recast the galleries to make sure it doesn't become a kind of football in that debate. Moving on quickly to other kinds of material, I mean, here's an example of a very dated image from our Roman life, Greek and Roman life gallery. This is an image of a very sad-looking Greek child sitting in one of our potties. It's one of my favourite images in the museum, but I think it gives you some impression of how much that whole world of the intellectual, of the social everyday life of the ancient world needs to be revived. And I think it's also difficult, to my mind, coming from the university world, because it seems to me an area where, just like some of these intellectual conceptions, how you frame the Hellenistic world, where it's actually, there isn't really material that does that. There's lots of material on demography and life cycles, but actually these questions of how we represent these things aren't ones which are being very debated in ancient historical scholarship, more now than they were, but it's still, I think, at an early stage. So trying to find a way through that is difficult. I then want to move very quickly, in my remaining minutes, into kind of monumental material. So I think there are lots of challenges for us in terms of representing this in a more, let's say, more appealing fashion than we do at the moment. So I'm, as a historian of religion predominantly, I'm very interested in how we represent religious experience. So these are the famous branchidae from Didyma in Asia Minor, which line the processional way, probably in a semicircle. So trying to find some way of making them part of an approach to divinity seems to me to be an attractive thing. Trying to show the experience of approaching the worshipper, so these are others which we have in the reserve, the limestone votive figures from Cyprus, which you can see beautifully done in the museum in Nicosia, where they have a kind of mass of them, I think again offer the opportunity for showing some of the experience of the individual worshipper, at least gesturing towards it in terms of how we do our displays, rather than it being a kind of, I always think the way in which gods are represented is a little bit like sort of zoological specimen. They're seen in that way even in books. But I think we need to try to revive some of that impression for those that haven't thought about it as lived experience. And then we move on to the largest monumental material in the museum. So, I mean, the mausoleum, this is the mausoleum room as it is now, the mausoleum of Halicarnassus. It looks sometimes, when the benches are arranged differently, as if Artemisia and Mausolus are giving a lecture to school children, especially if the children are lined up in front of them. It's made as unmonumental as it possibly could, I think. And if you compare it to the early 20th century alternative, where, I mean, there's an awful lot of reconstruction in here. That wheel, there's not much of it, which is ancient. But there is an attempt to move towards a bold, monumental, to gesture to the impression of a building of such enormous scale. There's much of it from the reserves that we can bring up into light. So here are many of the lions. We can do the same, I think, with the Artemisian from Ephesus. So we're looking very much towards our Berlin friends in terms of how we reintegrate sculpture and architecture in new ways within this structure. So we have one sculpted column drum on display, but there's much more material which we can put together into at least the makings of a single column from the Artemisian. And we have ambitions to reconstruct the Nereid monument in the round, because we have enough material to do so. And then finally, the final thing I want to talk about is, if you like, the difficult questions of the history of archaeology and the history of our collections. So the man on the left, for those who don't know him, is Charles Newton. He was the first head of my department in the 1860s till the 1880s, and he was the excavator of Halicarnassus, and effectively the person who, in more political ways, engineered much of our collections, so from North Africa and Turkey. He looks down, that portrait looks down at my desk disapprovingly. We have a vast archive of his material. We have about 10,000 letters uncatalogued. We have his photographs. He was very early pioneer in taking a photographer with him to Bodrum for the excavations of Halicarnassus, and you can see a lithograph and a photograph at the top from the removal of the Lion of Cnidos, and you can just about make out the same figure in a straw hat on the bottom, sitting on the left, in the remains of the mausoleum. So if you look to your left in a seated position, you can see Charles Newton sitting there amidst the ruins of the mausoleum. It's an absolutely critical thing, in my view, that we open those up. They're currently uncatalogued, just huge wealth. Much of the material there is inevitably going to be controversial, but I think it is necessary for us to do that in all sorts of areas and to make sure that that history is reflected in our display, and that the display is no longer one of a single neutral voice, if you like, the British Museum neutral voice, but includes other voices. And that leads me into the theme of partnerships. I think our partnerships are not very heralded. We don't talk about them very much. We don't have a single prestige gallery in the north of England or Abu Dhabi or anywhere else. We have maintained a different model of trying to plant lots of small, what we call partnership galleries elsewhere in Britain. So in Manchester, in Carlisle, there's one opening in Norwich. But I think we want to do much more of this and much more internationally. So the big new one, which is in partnership with Berlin and the Getty, is the project with CSMVS in Mumbai. And that model of global co-curation, going back to the issues of controlling your brand as it goes outside the museum, not one where we control the brand, but one where we learn from a genuine partnership, I hope, is one which we want to pursue, particularly from the point of view of this new museum. So the ambition, I hope, is with that and with the documentation, which is now a huge priority, is that that the master plan evolves from being a master plan very much in Bloomsbury to being a master plan which is Bloomsbury and online and in a number of sites dispersed around the world, not just in Britain. Thank you very much.